Okay, so before we go on to the novel, a very quick reference or very quick understanding of where the author comes from and what is her background. Jean Rhys, a white Creole author born in Dominica. So her father, she is a white Creole. That means Creole means one. The common understanding of Creole is that she is, or that is one of the common understanding of Creole is that is a person of mixed race, right? A person of European and African descent, mixed parentage. Now this is, but white Creole, Creole also refers to the people of European, French, English, Portuguese, Spanish descent who were born in the colonies. So she is a Creole author. Her father was a Welsh doctor and the mother a Creole of Scottish origin. That means they're both Europeans of Welsh origin and of Scottish origin. So she is a Caucasian. She is of European descent, but born in Dominica. So a white Creole author born in Dominica, and she writes White Sargasso Sea in 1966. It is a very economically written, it's almost a novella, quite a contrast to Jane Eyre, the novel Jane Eyre, which is a very thick book. White Sargasso Sea is is very economical, and she wrote it for almost 2 decades, carefully writing, reworking, editing, deleting, adding, so that there is nothing redundant, there is nothing useless or nothing. It is it is very economical, and she wrote and rewrote this book for a long time before it was published in 1966. And it is important to understand White Sargasso Sea. We must think of this concept of intertextuality, where the two texts refer to each other, where the two texts exist in a dialogue with each other. So the understanding of White Sargasso Sea remains incomplete without a reference to Jane Eyre. And once we have read White Sargasso Sea, we can deconstruct, we can question, we can read the subtext that underlies Jane Eyre better, so that after reading White Sargasso Sea, Jane Eyre is never the same text, right? You read Jane Eyre as a text, as a story of Jane and her romance with Rochester, the hardships they face and their final union, that kind of a romance. But after you have read White Sargasso Sea, you can not look at Jane Eyre the same way, so that the two texts exist in a dialogue. It is a response novel. White Sargasso Sea is a response novel. It enters into a dialogue with Jane Eyre. It is telling its story with reference to, with kind of in a dialogue. It is, the two texts are talking to each other. They are in a dialogue, so that we understand their subtext. We have a greater understanding of the text, and also the times, the ideologies, whatever ideas underlie the two texts become clearer in reference to one another. So the novel is written, this particular novel is written in 3 parts. The first is narrated by Antoinette Cosway, who later on becomes Bertha Mason. It is about Antoinette's childhood, her growing up in a convent, almost a parallel to Jane Eyre, Jane's childhood, and her growing up in Lowood Academy. So here we have Antoinette's childhood and her schooling at the convent. Part 2 is by an unnamed male protagonist. We extrapolate through the references, through the hints, and through Rhys' own letters, we extrapolate that it is Rochester, it is Bronte's Rochester. The third part, which is the shortest part of the novel, is narrated by the mad woman in the attic of Thornfield Hall, right. It is as if it is, we are in her mind, we are in her madness, we hear her voice, we kind of we hear that the voice of the mad woman in the attic. That is the third part of the novel. A little bit more about the background of the text. It happens in the Caribbean islands. Where are the Caribbean? If you see here, between North and South America, and also on this in this they are located in this ocean, this white, the here is white, here is the Sargasso Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, and somewhere in the middle, again in the middle of Europe and North America, Americas. The first part happens here. This is her childhood. Jamaica, this is Jamaica. We move to Dominica, and the third part we are back in England in Thornfield Hall here. So now we must understand that overall on overtly, colonialism is about, we talk about colonial ideologies, we talk about colonial, how it has changed, influenced mindsets and all, but the bottom line is that colonialism was an economic enterprise, right. It was about trade and gaining wealth and making profitable trade around the world. So to trade with Americas, to trade with the Caribbeans, there were a lot of plantations that came into being here. So to access those, the European ships would have to pass through Sargasso Sea here. It has to be, you have to travel through Sargasso Sea, and in early European literature, it is depicted as a place of mystery and danger, where ships get mired, lost, they are attacked by pirates. It's like an oceanic black hole, right. In it, this very dangerous sea has to be crossed to get to the Caribbean and then have access to the wealth of Caribbean. So this group of islands between Europe and America are the Caribbean. They are lush tropical islands. Some of these islands are still under administration of European nations. Some of them have gained independence. Jamaica, which is important for this book, is of course independent now. So as I said, there is a whole cycle of trade, there is a whole trade route, there is a whole commodity exchange where Caribbean kind of falls on that trade route. Now I'm just look at that here. Here are the Caribbean islands. So here we have commodity trade going on. The manufactured goods like textile, rum, manufactured goods go to Africa and to the rest of the world, here to Asia. From Africa, slaves are taken to Americas, the Caribbean. That's why we have African Americans and a lot of Africans in Caribbean. And from here, America, the Caribbean, sugar, tobacco, potato, cotton, it all goes to Europe to feed its mills, to feed its industrial revolution, and then the manufactured goods, as I said, come to Africa and go to Asia and so on. So this is kind of Caribbean lies on this trade, on the circuit of trade. And because it lies on the circuit of trade and the slaves brought in from Africa, there are plantations set up like cotton, tobacco, sugar, so that it is fed into the mills in Europe, as I said. So we have change in the demographics, right? We have change in the demographics. The natives of this area are pushed away. They kind of almost they disappear, and we have the entire island. If we see White Sargasso Sea, we just hear of Creoles, who are people of European origin, Creoles who are mixed race. We hear of Africans or the slaves in a way. So we do not really hear of any native Caribbean. So we see that the demographic, the population has changed, the makeup of the ethnic makeup has changed. Also the landscape changes with the coming of plantations, wide plantation to have cash crops and so on. So, this is forests are cleared for that, the tropical forests are cleared to set up plantations, those plantations, and you kind of repeatedly on a wide scale practice commercial agriculture. You cultivate crops that can be exported, which are in demand by the industrializing Europe. So, not really focus on food in Caribbean or to fulfill the needs of the Caribbean, but to fulfill the needs of the metropole, that is England. So, we have a plantation society which comes up in these areas, in these colonies like the Caribbeans, and it is a very hierarchical society. The plantation society is a very hierarchical society. It is like a pyramid. On the top is a European planter who owns the land, who controls the trade, and then there are slaves at the bottom brought of this pyramid, brought from Africa, and they work on these plantations. They are in much higher a percentage. You just have one owner, but you have multiple number of slaves. But so it is like more people on this at the bottom of the pyramid, but one person on the top holds all the power, holds all the wealth, and even though they are the minority of the population. Now, as I said, these islands are controlled by various European nations, and over the time there are wars, there are battles, they keep on fighting each other, and the islands change hands. So, sometime Jamaica was under the control of Spanish, and then it was taken over by English, so that even the European population is mixed over here. Antoinette's father is of English descent. Mr. Cosway is of English descent, and the mother is a Martinique, that is a French Creole. So, you see that this kind of intermingling is fairly common in the 19th century Caribbean. Very important reference, especially in the first part, the marooned community. Now, who were the marooned community? We all know that slavery was abolished by England in somewhere in 1830s, 1833, somewhere around that time. So, when slavery is abolished, it's a gradual long process. I mean, they went to the apprenticeship system, which was not much different from slavery, but slaves do get freedom, and lots of these slaves they kind of left the plantations, they dispersed to the mountains, and they established maroon communities. They established maroon communities in the mountains, and these maroon communities are former slaves, right. So, during the centuries of slavery, Jamaican maroons established free communities in the mountains in the interior of Jamaica, where they maintained their freedom and independence under the leadership of maroon leaders. So, they are kind of isolated communities, and why I say this is why I bring up this term is Antoinette's mother, Annie, in the first part of the novel constantly talks and uses this phrase of marooned. We are marooned here. So, she is using it in a different context. She is using it in a different context where she, as a former plantation owner's widow, is kind of stuck in this estate surrounded by very hostile ex-slaves, former slaves. So, she is feeling isolated, marooned, but maroon is also a very social and political term used in that used in that context of Caribbean slavery. Now, just the last bit. So, so there is slave trade and the coming of Africans and plantations, and they work in the plantations. But what happens when to the plantations when slavery is abolished and the slaves leave the plantations. Remember that there is one owner, but there are plenty of slaves to work on the plantations. That they are the ones who are actually doing the work, the manual labor, the skills required to the plantation to run the plantations are with the slaves actually. So, what happens to the plantations when the slaves leave? The plantations go into a ruin, right? From very successful commercial enterprise, commercial agriculture, they are slowly falling into ruins, and that is what happening to Colibri, the Causeway estate. That is what is happening to over there. So, who works now? Who works in these plantations now? So, once slave trade is abolished and slavery is abolished, there is another there is another similarly exploitative system that comes into being, and that is indentured labor. Labor from Asia, primarily from India and the Indian subcontinent. They are made to sign agreements which are not really to their benefit, and half the time they don't even know what they are signing on. And then the labor is sent to work here in Caribbean. They also go to Southeast Asia, islands like Fiji, Mauritius, and that is why we have a substantial population of people of Indian origin in all these places, because they were again coerced as indentured laborers to go and work in the plantations, which were falling into ruin after the slavery was abolished. And if you want to read a little bit more, or if you want to have some more idea of indentured labor and how exploitative that system was, maybe you can read Amitav Ghosh's The Ibis Trilogy, especially the opium farming and the indentured labor sent to Mauritius and other. If you read the first book of the novel of the series, The Sea of Poppies, A Sea of Poppies, you would get some idea of indentured labor and how the system worked. So, when we talk about the slave trade being abolished, when we talk about the independence of the countries, independence of these islands or various colonies, freedom, decolonization, we must remember that it does not happen in one day. We celebrate one day as Independence Day. It is 15th August in India and so on. It is one day, but it is kind of a culmination of decades and decades of almost a century of economic and political struggle. So, it is an effect of a constant struggle over a long period of time. And similarly, the abolishing of trade or slave trade was a kind of was an effect of a struggle over a long period of time. And we see in the novel that it almost seems as if the Africans over there, the slaves, the former slaves, they are angry, they are mysterious, they are hostile. But we must remember that beneath that hostility, beneath that anger that is directed towards the Causeway, there is a history of oppression, there is a history of colonial violence perpetrated against them by people like Causeway, the plantation owners. Antoinette's father, Annie Causeway's husband, he was a slave owner. What was the condition in plantations? There is whipping, there is flogging. And when the government tried to regulate and think about the condition of the slaves, the planters' bodies, various organizations of the planters' bodies, various organizations comprising of the plantation owners, they vehemently opposed these regulations. In Malaysia, there are several records of slave labor, indentured labor running away and then being brought back, and because they are the property of the plantation owner. So, it was a really bad condition. There was disease, unhygienic living conditions. plenty of workers and slaves dying on the plantations, and when there is regulation, the planters organizations oppose those regulations vehemently. In fact, in 1831 there is a huge rebellion in this part of the world, and it resulted in burning of plantations, violence, murder, and we see a little bit of that angst, we see that anger in this book, White Sargasso Sea, especially in the beginning of the book. So, so that we must remember that there is a fairly good reason to that hostility and the mysteriousness and a complete lack of empathy that the slave population shows to Causeways, right? They have faced a history of violence, suppression, and wrongs done to them. Hard work, deaths due to hard work, poor treatment, all those are a part of plantation history, including Causeway Plantation, that is Colibri. So now when all this is happening, till now we have been talking about all that is happening in this colony. What is actually happening in England at that time, in the middle of 19th century or Victorian period as we know it. This is a period of tremendous economic development, and someone alive in 1804, like right at the beginning of the 19th century, would know about electric telegraph, steamship, circular saw, bicycle, steam powered locomotive. They would have heard of light bulbs, typewriters are coming, things like that are coming into being. They are kind of making these inventions. This technological development is happening in this. This is kind of a time of prosperity for England, and a large part of that prosperity comes from various colonies, right? It comes from various colonies. I mean, there is rubber tire, but where is the rubber coming from? Southeast Asia, right? So, or the other colonies here. So, we must remember that this industrialization and this technological development in England or Europe, for that matter, in this period comes at the cost of the underdevelopment in the colonies, right? So, that's what is happening in England. In the context of women's issues, women's rights, Bronte, as we have already discussed, wrote Jane Eyre in 1847, but towards the end of 18th century, Mary Wollstonecraft has already written a vindication of the rights of women, and she has already argued that women are rational beings capable of complex thoughts, but were limited by their training, by their circumstances. So, in a way, we already see this. We see that we see where Jane Eyre, where Bronte is deriving her matter from. So, as we discussed that the book is set in 1839. It starts in Jamaica, where we see her childhood, moves to Dominica, where they live for some time after their marriage, and then the end in England, in Thornfield Hall in England, as it was in Jane Eyre. Now, we set whatever we see in the novel, we set it in the historical context, what was happening in Caribbean or in the colony at that time. 1833, as we discussed, there is law to abolish slavery, but the slaves are really set free in 1833. There is an apprentice system in the intermediate year. The slaves are now called apprentices, and for the next 6 years they are still functionally the slaves. There are no salaries, they are not really free, but they work on the plantations, and in return they get housing, medical benefits, food, and other such benefits. But the black population is not really pleased with this arrangement. They do not want apprenticeship. So, in 1838, British government cancels apprenticeship and everyone is set free. And the novel begins after that. It is set in the year after that. Now, the emancipation, after the emancipation of the Slaves Emancipation Act, the government meant to compensate the slave owners for the loss of their property. So, the government means to compensate not the slaves for the years of slavery and the years of oppression and being rendered like being dehumanized. They do not, that is not important. What is important is that the slave owners have lost their property, their human property, and the government, the British government, meant to compensate it. 20 million pounds was supposed to be paid to the slave owners, and this is what this is mentioned on the first page of the book, where Mr. Luttrell is waiting for the compensation to arrive. But to a lot of old estates in the Caribbean, the money never came. So, the estates degenerated and they fell into ruin. So, not only did the slave owners lose their human property, they also suffered the deterioration of their landed property, their plantations. Now, there is also a kind of, the social dynamics are changing. There is a new social division that is coming into being between the old planter aristocracy, that is the old slave owning planters, and this is where Antoinette belongs, right? By her birth, she belongs to this group, the old planter aristocracy. Her father, Cosway, was a slave owner, who he had a plantation, Colibri, where he had slaves to work for him. So, these are superseded by the new merchant class, like Mason, her new father, the man that her mother marries. So, they are superseded by this merchant class, who doesn't really, who hasn't really lived in Caribbean, is not really in touch with the history of the region. He does not really, Mr. Mason, he keeps on dismissing Anne's fears about the hostility around them. He does not understand all that. He does not understand why the local black population is angry. He is a capitalist. He is there for money. So there is this rich, formerly very rich, earlier very rich, but now decaying, degenerate aristocracy. And it is degenerate. And Antoinette's birth father, Cosway, has fathered a number of mixed race children all over the island. There is one place where Antoinette is bullied by a red haired boy and a girl on their way to school. So they are, so they are half siblings. There is Daniel Cosway, who kind of, whose letter destroys the relationship between Rochester and Antoinette. He is also her half sibling, and he is angry. His angst, his resentment at being a bastard, at having no social advantages, at being downtrodden, are very real and understandable. So these are all product of the slave owning planter aristocracy, which had, for a long time they had power, they had wealth, and they exploited the slaves. They sexually exploited the native women or the women, the slave women, and this is kind of, this angst, this resentment is a build up of all that time of exploitation. Native population we hardly see, right? We do not really hear of any native Caribbean person in the whole novel. We hear of Creoles, we hear of the colonizers coming from Europe, we hear of the slaves and the Africans, but we do not really hear of any native population. In fact, they have been wiped out. The town where they go for honeymoon, with this very morbid name of the town, Massacre, it was where the natives of Caribbean islands might have been massacred at some point of time, but it is forgotten history now. Even when in 19th century they have forgotten, it is how the natives of the island were kind of wiped out. So as I said, we have already discussed this. Who would work on the plantations is a very important thing, because when the novel starts, we see that the earlier plantations, which were responsible for much of the wealth going to England, are now falling into ruins, and they urgently need people to work in the plantations. At the same time, plantations are also a site of hostility, because it has been this plantation has been a place. It embodies, it's like a chronotope, time and space. It embodies this plantation kind of embodies exploitation, violence, the history of violence, the history of colonial exploitation. It is the time and space, what Bakhtin calls the chronotope. So the chronotope of the plantation, which carries within it a history of colonial violence, colonial domination and exploitation. So that is the question. And who would work on the plantations from slave owners? We know that in a few years these plantations would be worked on by the indentured labor coming from Asia, specifically from South Asia. But this is the intermediate time when everything is falling into ruins. The compensation has not arrived, there are no slaves, there is no labor to work on the plantation, and the old planter class, the old planter aristocracy has lost its wealth, its prosperity and its power, and they are somehow struggling. And suddenly we see that the equations have overturned. Earlier on they had all the power, but now they are fewer in number, there are more slaves and they are independent. The ex-slaves are independent, free, and there is a palpable amount of hostility that we see Causeway family experiencing. Okay, so that is and of course the perspective characters in the novel are Antoinette, who belongs to this old planter aristocracy. That's where her family comes from, and Rochester, who's kind of from the new merchant class, the new set of colonizers. So these are some important terms that you have to keep in mind when you are reading White Sargasso Sea, or you have to learn before you read White Sargasso Sea. We have already talked about the maroon or the maroons or the marooned community, that is the runaway slaves or the slaves who refuse to work in the plantations, they run away. Later on, after 1833, they left the plantations and went and lived in the mountains, their hideaways in the mountains. And they created these small communities, free communities, living away from the plantations. Creole, as I said, is in this case over here in this novel is a person of English or European descent, born in Caribbean, and it has, later on creolization or Creole, it became like mixing, intermingling of races. But here it is, and that intermingling of races already carries this connotations of racial impurity, right? Connotations of this whole idea of racial purity and impurity. Creolization as a process of racial, becoming, creating an kind of polluting the pure race. But even the Creoles of English or European descent, like Jean Rhys herself, the author herself, or Antoinette Causeway in the novel, they are looked down from by the people who were born and who come from England. So Rochester kind of, or Mason, although they fall in love and they marry these Creole women, they are rather they are very dismissive of these women, as if Annette Cosway and Antoinette Cosway are in some way inferior. They have been tropicalized, right? Living in the tropics, being born in the tropics, having grown up in the tropics, they have become tropicalized. The English and the Creoles of English and European descent have become tropicalized. You know, the effect of the weather and the plantations and the, you know, that lush and luxurious life, and they have become lazy. Although they are of English and European descent, they are lazy, sensual, passionate, excessive. Do you remember, as Rochester is discussing in that clip we watched in earlier on, tantalizing, seductive, rich, excessive. So in a way, it's almost that it might be pure race, but it has kind of degenerated in the Creoles of your English Creoles or European Creoles for that matter. Patois is basically the dialect that develops when people come in contact, the people of different cultures come in contact, different languages come in contact. So it has, again, it implies low social status, it implies impurity, not pure language, not the cultured language, sorry. Also, I think important, apart from Emancipation Act that we discussed, the emancipation of slaves in the context of which the novel is set, equally important is Married Women's Property Act, and this came into being much after the events in the novel, in this one or even in Jane Eyre, that it happens in 1870. Now, before this act, married women's personal property became her husband's absolutely, and income that descended to her as an heiress, any inheritance, any income that comes from her inheritance that the father has settled to her, any money that she earns belonged absolutely to the husband. That is married till this is before the act. It's only after 1870 that women get some more rights over the property, but prior to the act, prior to 1870, woman's property moved from father to the husband absolutely. Any income that she is getting, any inheritance, any money that she earns belong absolutely to the husband.